Now we turn to part 2 of software development, looking at Clickwrap Agreements that bind us to the rules set by the contracts we form and the sometimes catastrophic technology failures that result from inappropriate software testing. The learning outcomes include demonstrate the importance of quality in software development, particularly for safety-critical systems that may cause harm to people, and evaluate the human and environmental impact of technology failures in the past and how to avoid them in the future. Have you ever seen these options on your laptop, tablet, phone, or desktop? Only every time you get a new software product or a new mobile app for your phone or an app for your tablet. While we click on I agree, often because we need or want the product, we need to understand we're entering into a binding contract with the owner of the application or software or technology that we plan to use. If you are 18 years old and click on I agree, you are bound by the stipulations in the contract. Organizations may use this technique to protect their intellectual property. For instance, if they want to make sure you don't get down to the program level and steal their code. Reverse engineering is always legal unless you agree by contract or other binding legal stipulation not to do it. I can buy a chair, take it apart, and then try to build one of my own. That's reverse engineering, and again, it's legal unless you agree for it not to be legal. We usually agree to that with any of the products we use. Some people say, well, I bought a copy of Office so I can do whatever I want with it. You may be able to sell your copy of Office as long as that's what your agreement says. If it does allow the first sale doctrine, you would be able to sell your license to someone else as long as you remove the entire program from your computer. You see, you have purchased a license to use their program, not the program itself. That's their intellectual property, and you bought one license to use it for as long as the contract stipulates. You never own their intellectual property. You're borrowing it, in effect, with their permission for some agreed upon period of time. By clicking I agree, a reasonable person would know that they should read what they're agreeing to do before signing or clicking. But we don't read it, and organizations know that. Remember this the next time you get an option to click on the I agree button. Clickwrap licenses are one of the main ways and likely the most effective method to protect software and applications. Companies should pursue other methods of protecting as well, but Clickwrap licenses are generally the best way to protect your product or service. For a Clickwrap license to be enforceable, the customer must do something to indicate agreement with the terms. In many cases, this means clicking on the I agree or agree button or something similar. The organizations wanting to license the product or service must make sure that customers know or should have known that they were looking at licensing terms. They read and understood the terms, published at an appropriate reading level and in a readable font, for instance. And whether you actually read them or not, you should have read the terms, as our busy, reasonable person would have done. The customer must positively accept the terms. Selecting the appropriate button qualifies here. Finally, the customer must have the opportunity to withdraw their consent if they made a mistake. For instance, they may decide that they do not want to agree to the terms listed and thus won't use the product or service. Customers must be allowed to withdraw at any time if they choose to do so. Companies have now determined the best way to make sure that their Clickwrap agreements are clear, accurate, and complete. They learned it in Spec v. Netscape, which was the first case on Clickwrap agreements in 2002. When installing Netscape, users also installed a smart download plugin. The plaintiffs alleged that Netscape violated their privacy because smart download installed ID tags on users' computers without their permission. Netscape, in contrast, asked that the case be dismissed, saying that the users had agreed to submit claims to arbitration in the Clickwrap Agreement they agreed to. That was part of the licensing terms when downloading Netscape. However, when the case was heard by the Second Court of Appeals, they found that the users of Smart Download never had to agree to the terms of a license. The license was visible only if the users voluntarily scrolled down to the next screen, making the terms somewhat deceptive. In effect, the Smart Download web page concealed that users were also agreeing to the terms and conditions associated with Netscape. The court determined that our very busy, reasonable person would not have known to scroll or had any way to indicate affirmative agreement. Thus, the Court of Appeals affirmed the district court's decision that the plaintiffs are not bound by arbitration. As the ruling found, licenses are not enforceable if there is not reasonable notice of the existence of a license and unambiguous consent to those terms. While this case was settled, Netscape came out of it pretty good. They did agree to stop collecting user data and to destroy any data they had already collected. But they didn't admit any wrongdoing, and thus the plaintiffs were unable to collect damages. Every organization that used BrowserWrap or Clickwrap agreements took note of the Netscape case. Thus, companies now make the terms clearer. If you think you will be able to get around the rules specified when you indicate affirmative agreement online, you would be sadly mistaken. Even though most of us don't read the fine print, a reasonable person has the opportunity to do so. As long as it's not buried on a page you don't have to visit prior to agreeing to the contract. Netscape was an outlier. Companies almost always win these cases now, if they even make it to court. What does that mean? We should read the terms and conditions that we agreed to abide by. Will you do it? Do you think I will? Licenses are not enforceable if there's not reasonable notice of the existence of a license and unambiguous consent to those terms. Let's look at an example where email messages became the subject of contention. Starkey reserved a vacation to the Galapagos Islands through G Adventures. Starkey alleged that one of the G Adventures employees sexually assaulted her while they were on the trip, and she filed a suit in New York. Starkey didn't realize that she had consented to Canadian court jurisdiction in the terms and agreements. When she booked the tour, G sent her 3 separate email messages, each one containing a hyperlink to their terms and conditions. One portion of the terms and conditions contained a forum selection clause, which required G to go to Canada to file suit, or required Starkey to go to Canada to file suit against G. Both sides agreed that Starkey never clicked on the hyperlink to read the terms and conditions. Even so, the district court dismissed the case, saying that G had reasonably communicated forum selection in their terms. Our reasonable person is getting yet another workout here too. The Court of Appeals affirmed the lower court ruling, but conceded that the forum selection clause was a close call. They agreed that the case would have been much easier if G had used a Clickwrap mechanism to provide reasonable notice to Starkey and obtain consent for where cases could be brought. With mass market licenses, those distributed with Microsoft Office, for instance, the lawyers have to make sure that all portions of the license are readable, understandable, offered for review by users, and complete. A term will not be considered a valid portion of a license if it is unconscionable. That's not unconscious like many of you are as you review these lectures, but unconscionable. If something is so bad that a reasonable person would say that you can't make it part of the terms and conditions, then it might be considered unconscionable. For instance, if you agree to Microsoft terms and agreements to use their software, they can't say that you're unable to make public comment against them by protesting in person, online, etc. This portion of a contract would be unconscionable because it interferes with your right to free speech about the service and/or products you purchase. Similarly, Target can't put on their receipt that you sign when you make a purchase that you won't say anything bad about them online or in person. That would be an unconscionable portion of the contract. Further, unless specifically prohibited, customers are legally able to reverse engineer a product to make it interoperable. For instance, cases have been brought against Sony and Microsoft and others for not allowing people to reverse engineer their products to make sure the games they create will work with each system. The courts have not reached agreement on this, although the Clickwrap Agreements usually make it very clear that you may not reverse engineer. Don't count on the courts to say that any part of a contract you agreed to is unconscionable, though. The lawyers have worked on this one for years, and if you agree to terms and conditions, then you must follow the agreement, just like contract law. Let's change gears, so to speak, and look at another place where software development practices are important, particularly the design of security at every phase of the project. You probably heard about hackers taking over a car, maybe from a Wired article and accompanying video that went viral. Take a look at the first YouTube video here. It shows how hackers might take over the steering in our increasingly smarter cars. It's a scary thought, and you can imagine the lawsuits if accidents occur due to a lack of security. Now take a look at the second video, which shows hackers using OnStar to locate, unlock, and remotely start cars. It's very scary to think that hackers could intrude on you and your car and cause your car to respond to commands from someone other than the driver. So can my car be hacked? Maybe I need to go and get an old car with few computer components. I guess the cars with computers aren't going to work after the electromagnetic pulse, if you believe some of the dystopian literature. But let's see what the experts say. I'm sure they're going to agree. Reputable sources like the FBI, the National Highway Traffic and Safety Administration, and the Department of Transportation say yes. In fact, they held a joint press conference in 2016 after the Wired article and said you needed to make sure you listened to recalls and in particular made sure to get updates to the computer components in your car, just like you do with other recalls. It's settled now. The FBI says we should be concerned about people hacking our cars. But Scientific American says that it's nearly impossible for someone to hack your car. They pointed out that in prior reports, the people reporting the hack capability had been working on it for a whole year, and with the owner's permission and cooperation. Protect your car data and information like you protect your digital data and information, and it's unlikely that someone can hack your car. Now I'm confused. It's very likely someone can hack your car, but it's nearly impossible for it to happen. Let's see if a third source can break the tie. U.S. News and World Report said that it's not realistic now that people can hack your car, but as we add more devices and more entry points, even going so far as driverless cars, hacks may be more likely, or as they say, maybe in the future. They correctly note that most hacks steal your car, its contents, or your data in terms of your license and credit cards, and don't control your car. So we should absolutely be concerned about something that's nearly impossible right now, but maybe a problem in the future. The experts have reached no consensus yet. The best advice is to simply guard all of your data, including your car, as you would your password and your bank account and so forth. It's another data access point, and although hackers haven't made inroads now, we should still be vigilant. And we should thank the software developers that have, thus far, kept us fairly safe from hackers in our car. With safety critical systems, those that may cause injury or death, flawless performance of the software and the mobile application is required. There are no do-overs. It must be as close to 100% as possible. And what will that do? Cause you to take more time and resources and do more testing throughout the development process? Yes. The key assumption with these types of systems is that we may not be able to achieve safety by following our standard methodology. Rather, we must take extra steps, document more thoroughly, and do that again and again, over and over, constantly in a vigilant manner, constantly checking and rechecking, and understanding that predicting how people actually use software is also important. For an example of a safety critical system that failed, take a look at this short YouTube video on Chernobyl in Ukraine, where a nuclear meltdown occurred in 1986. Every first responder who showed up at the scene died of radiation poisoning. They didn't know a meltdown had occurred and raced to help people out of a large fire. The entire town of close to 300,000 people was evacuated and bused to another city, although some argue the evacuation was completed too slowly. People left with the clothes on their back and never went back. Scientists predicted that plants, trees, and wildlife would disappear, poisoned by the large amounts of radiation. To their surprise, wildlife has adjusted and is now able to thrive, as are plants and trees. However, people are not allowed to live in the meltdown area, and they likely never will be allowed back. They do very limited tours under tight conditions. As for me, I would choose not to go on the tour. What happened at Chernobyl? One power surge in this plant led to explosions and a plume of radioactive smoke. When the armed services came to try to seal the plant after they knew what happened, they were limited to a couple of minutes only as they tried to contain and prevent the spread of radiation. Even with a couple of minutes of exposure and the best suits available, many of these soldiers also developed injuries and illness from the experience. Other nuclear disasters of note include Fukushima, Japan in 2011, and 3 Mile Island in the U.S., although Chernobyl has the dubious distinction of the most lives lost directly, around 30, with another 30 and probably much higher who died of causes directly attributable to radiation poisoning, including about 15 children who had died of thyroid cancer as of 2008. The indirect costs due to illness and injury are difficult to estimate. The moral of the story for safety critical systems: if you don't design safety into them, they may fail and people may die. More caution than normal is required for these systems. There are many software products and applications that have failed to deliver. Some are famous, some cause loss of life, and all could have been avoided if the developers took the necessary time to ensure quality. Let's start with Lieutenant Colonel Stanislav Petrov, who was on duty in 1983 when a Soviet early warning system said that the U.S. had launched 5 nuclear missiles toward Russia. Petrov had a gut feeling that something wasn't right, and he reasoned that the U.S. would have launched more than 5 missiles if they had launched. We thus averted World War III. What was the problem? The system was supposed to filter out sunlight reflections, which could give false missile warnings. In this case, the system failed, but the backup, Petrov, decided that it was a false alarm. Now let's look at the Mars Climate Observer. It was well on its way to Mars and communicating with Earth. Suddenly, as it hit the Martian atmosphere, all communication was lost. What happened? A subcontractor for NASA had used U.S. measurement conventions, inches, feet, etc., as opposed to NASA-specified metric units, which were used in Europe and everywhere else. Thus, the missile was unsure where it was and burned up in the atmosphere. That's a costly mistake. But it did not lead to harm to people. The Patriot Missile was the first version of a weapon system that was designed to shoot down an enemy's missile, diverting it and or destroying it. On February 25, 1991, an Iraqi Scud missile hit the U.S. Army barracks, killing 28 American soldiers. There was a Patriot missile nearby waiting to launch. So why didn't it? What happened here? During testing, the Patriot had never been in operation for as long as this particular Patriot was running. It had been on for 100 hours. The Israelis had reported this error to the Americans and suggested that they reboot frequently until the bug was resolved. While in operation for 100 hours, the clock had drifted slightly, and a floating point decimal like 1/3, which is 0.33333 forever, was rounded incorrectly. Due to the missile's speed, the timing error meant the incoming missile was missed by about 600 meters, resulting in loss of life for the 28 soldiers. The next day, the Army received an update that patched this problem. Let's look at 2 more examples of software failures. Did you ever hear about the Y2K problem? Developers, in a short-sighted view, rounded all dates to 2 digits. Thus, 1988 was 88, 1942 was 42, etc. Uh-oh, we're almost at the year 2000. What in the world will happen? In all fairness to developers at the time, they had no idea that people would still be using spreadsheets and other programs almost 30 years later. People were speculating with Y2K that planes would be falling out of the skies and air traffic control would no longer function. COBOL programmers, who wrote most of the coding for governmental programs and who had been out of work for years, suddenly became a hot commodity. By the time Y2K got here, nothing happened. Everything functioned as it should have. Governmental officials were even flying at midnight to show the confidence they had that the system would work. As you see in this picture, some clocks had a few issues, but everything was resolved with minimal problems. Another software mishap was demonstrated with the Northeast blackout of 2003. The blackout included 45 million people in the Northeast and Midwestern U.S. and another 10 million in Ontario. An alarm system that was supposed to notify operators that they needed to redistribute power after a surge failed to work. As a result, the power issues raced through the energy management systems, overlapping all of them. What should have been a minor blackout for a short period of time until the power could be leveled out instead became an energy catastrophe. Some places were without power for a few days, while rural locations experienced almost a week of darkness. A small bug that affected the order of operations when the system became overloaded was the problem. A couple of other cases that you might want to take a look at. In 2015, you may have heard about a man who claimed that he had hacked into the flight engine controls of a passenger jet through the entertainment system of a major U.S. carrier. The FBI and the airline contend that he never had control of the engine controls. However, since the man tweeted that he had taken control of the aircraft, the FBI met him at the airport. A word of caution to all you would-be hackers. If you're going to break into an airline's controls, or even if you're just going to say you broke in, don't tell anyone on your personal Twitter account. You will get the attention of the FBI and local law enforcement. The best advice is to simply not hack into anyone's system. You should take a look at this short CNN video that gives a recap of the story. You can also take a look at this YouTube video that shows 10 disastrous software bugs. It's not a short video like I usually suggest, but it's worthwhile viewing. Let's take a closer look at another technology failure that caused harm to people. Ferris 25 was a radiation therapy machine built during the 1980s. When an update was made, there were 6 incidents where patients received massive overdoses of radiation. One patient, who had been receiving radiation therapy for quite some time, literally jumped up off the machine and said they were giving him too much radiation. Canada's Atomic Energy Commission came out and reviewed the machine and could find no problems. Neither could the developers of the code. It turns out that users had found a way to shortcut one of the screens, and the shortcut was also a shortcut to increase the radiation dose significantly. 3 of the patients died. A University of Washington investigation showed that lack of proper software testing was one of the key issues. Take a look at this short YouTube video to get more information on the Ferris 25 incident. Lessons learned from this error include: software can and will fail. Users will use the software in ways that you must anticipate. Testing may be difficult, costly, and time-consuming, but you must do it for safety-critical systems. Reusing older software, which was done in this case, may be dangerous. In this case, it was. Safety and usability exhibit tension on each other. To increase safety, you may compromise usability. The developers must find the right balance of security and usability based on the system being used. In addition, for safety-critical systems, IT professionals must take extra steps, including using a safety system engineer as an integral part of the project team. Create a hazard log that is reviewed and responded to throughout the project. Analyze risk and incorporate methods of minimizing risk throughout the project lifecycle. Have redundancy built into the system to make it safer and to recognize errors sooner. Take the time you need, the money you need to develop at the quality level required. Let's take, for instance, the recent Sony hack, which experts called the first major attack on a U.S. company to use a highly destructive class of malicious software that is designed to make computer networks unable to operate. That's pretty important. In November 2014, Sony discovered that their networks had been severely compromised. While hackers claimed that they had access for a year prior to discovery, it's difficult to determine how long Sony was under attack. Sony certainly did not have control of its network for at least days. Insider information, such as emails between employees, were published, as were executive salaries, contact information for employees and their families, and other private, confidential, personal, and embarrassing documents and email messages. For instance, 17 executives at Sony make over $1 million, and only one of them is a woman who made about $800,000 less than her male counterpart. One woman's breastfeeding schedule was even made public. GOP, which they called themselves, released huge amounts of data online. In all, about 200 gigabytes of data was leaked from the Sony attack. The hackers released 5 big-budget films online that had not yet made their theater debut. Once a movie is out there, of course, it's impossible to get back. Although Sony had legal and technology experts trying to wipe the data as soon as it was published, experts predict that the movies were quickly downloaded at least 100,000 times. The U.S. government believes that the hackers were associated with North Korea and were protesting the upcoming release of The Interview, which is a comedy about assassinating the leader of North Korea. The hackers threatened terrorist attacks if the movie was released in theaters. So Sony decided to skip theatrical release and went straight to streaming, hoping to distribute the film widely. At one point in the hack, Sony told its employees not even to use their personal phones to check their personal email messages using Sony's Wi-Fi. They did not have control of any part of their IT infrastructure. Sony made all employees go back to the dark days of pen and paper and fax machines rather than using any electronic devices. The Sony attack was known as a scorched earth attack because it wiped out a significant portion of Sony's IT infrastructure. Terabytes of data were stolen and ultimately brought the entertainment giant to its knees. The hackers initially asked for money, but experts now believe that was simply to confuse those who were trying to overcome the attack and buy some time to do further damage. If you're not already worried enough about your organization being compromised, in August 2017, HBO was compromised. And about 1.5 terabytes of data was stolen, or about 7 times as much as the Sony attack. Only a small amount has been released, including information about the popular, I like it too, Game of Thrones series. To summarize, it's a short summary of a very important problem. Technology, hardware, software, apps, etc., that may cause harm should be rigorously tested, accounting for the risk of failure and/or human error. If someone dies or is injured as a result of a technology failure, it's likely they will bring suit against the offender and they will probably receive damages.